I guess, not surprisingly, is that better tripartite coordination is needed. I think what I really liked about this was one of the ways in which, you know, the policy analysis was actually quite relational. I think we tend to get policy analysis of what's China doing or what's the EU doing or what's whoever's doing. And this was actually saying you have kind of reciprocal policy actions taking place. They're not done in isolation. And then looking at the bargaining within and between, I think gets picked up in another paper that we'll just discuss shortly. And I also think, you know, the conclusion, one of the kind of lacunae, which I think is a big issue, which I touched upon, is, you know, we need to understand not just the what and why of this competition, which is what this paper does, but also what that means for those recipients of the lending that they're trying to manage. And if we want to overcome those subtle forms of imperialism, you know, it's kind of, whose problem is it? It's kind of, if China's, you know, jostling with the bank or the fund or whoever, you know, and creating kind of chaos on the ground, then actually it's the poor recipients on the ground that have to deal with that problem, even though it's not of their own making. So I do think that's an issue that the paper highlights but doesn't get into. I think there was a couple of questions really. One on causality. I mean, has China led to the lack of coordination, or was it there beforehand? So it's not clear from the analysis whether China acts as a disruptor that unsettled a functioning system, or whether China's presence highlights and exacerbates existing schisms in a regime that was already unstable. So it's a kind of slightly causality and chicken and the egg. And I think, you know, as I said, I think the focus on China's infrastructure financing didn't surprise me as somebody who studies that stuff. But it was good to see that kind of macro level analysis. You might want to think about other work. Some of the colleagues at Manchester, Seth Schindler and others, are looking at kind of the new Cold War and the way in which infrastructure plays out. So geopolitically, might give you some context in which to look at how rival infrastructure programs are competed over, and you know, get some of the empirical detail that they and others and myself are beginning to generate around that. So yeah, a really nice paper to start with. I thought Nick's paper focusing on sovereign debt and the mechanisms for resolving debt was really interesting. And thanks to Nick for a very clear analysis of what can be quite a technically challenging area. I understood everything, and you know, some of that stuff gets quite complex. I guess Nick's arguing that with growing debt, the debt distress resolution mechanism is not working for a range of reasons, and some of which are related to China as a financier, and particularly its role as a bilateral rather than a multilateral lender, which is something the next paper also picks up on. And I guess that, you know, one of the things that Nick picks up on that Daniel might reflect on is that these issues are not solely related to China, but it's about the changing nature of development financing and the growing role of various private sector actors. So it's not just traditional versus Chinese donors, but there's a kind of wider array of financiers who are complicating that system. I think what was really revelatory for me from Nick's paper, though, was the increasing role that the US Federal Reserve is playing as a lender of the last resort. And as he points out, this has generally been a kind of role taken on by the IMF. The Chinese are not stepping into that position because they're largely bilateral lenders. And the kind of motivations, as I understand it, for the Fed doing this are to maintain the stability of the system rather than supporting individual countries as the bank or fund might do. And with you know, there's interesting issues with China transacting most of its lending outside of multilateral institutions. Their activities have the impact on the ability to discipline recipient countries. And as Daniel's paper acknowledges, and as we've heard before, you know, that allows some countries to sort of play donors off against one another. But what the outcome is, and which Nick alludes to in a series of short case studies, you actually get then a patchwork of quite ad hoc deals going on with particular countries, which echoes that point that Daniel makes about that lack of coordination in the previous paper. I guess my question to Nick is possibly an obvious one about the kind of, you know, you talk about the narrow application of US hegemony through the Fed. I mean, it seems to me it's potentially quite worrying in terms of accountability in the system, that we know the Bretton Woods institutions were far from perfect and that the voting rights were not evenly distributed, but there was some accountability due to the pooled nature of the institution. But I guess how far will the Fed, do you think, push unilateral agendas, and with what consequences? The third paper, I think, picks up nicely on a number of issues already raised in the first two papers. And at the heart of the paper is a kind of contradiction and a why question. And the question that UA poses is, you know, China's the largest sovereign creditor, but still prefers to work bilaterally and works through multilateral organizations. The question is, given it prefers bilateral lending, why does it bother with the multilateral institutions? And what I loved about this paper really was that there wasn't a single answer to the question in the sense of, she produces a kind of a very nuanced actor-centered perspective. There's no singular China here acting unilaterally and strategically in unimpeded ways. The nub of that argument is that Chinese actors continue to engage multilaterally, partly to help overcome the problems of bilateral relations and to nudge the international development regime into reflecting China's interests. And then there's this really nice set of 2 rounds of analysis captured in two really helpful tables to show who these key Chinese actors are, how they operate, and crucially why. And the argument is that there are both efficiency and strategic reasons for operating multilaterally. I guess my question really then is, and it may just be a very small issue about the word, but you said that China has adopted a comprehensive participation approach, but your analysis feels a little bit messier and more experimental than the word adopt sort of would signify to me. And I guess also in terms of the logic of your argument, if bilateralism functioned perfectly, if ever it could, is your argument that Chinese actors wouldn't bother at all with multilateral engagements, or there are other drivers that might lead them to do that? And the final paper, I think, takes us in a slightly different direction, but has lots of resonances, I think, with the other papers around sort of green lending. And they frame the analysis really nicely around an event. And that event was the September 2021 announcement by President Xi that they would end overseas investment in coal-fired power stations. And the paper seeks to understand kind of what was involved in that decision and why it happened when it did. And they use game theory, I think, quite helpfully. Often I don't understand game theory, but this game theory I did understand, to look at how the political forces impinged upon the decision, focusing on both kind of interstate, so between states or groups of states and China, and intrastate processes, so how domestic groups were placing pressure on the party to make those decisions. And again, like the previous paper, which I really like, it focuses on a range of actors: SOEs, state-owned enterprises, think tanks, ministries as actors in these bargaining processes. And really, the decision they argue the decision to end investment in these power stations was part of a much longer-term realization that there were higher financial risks from coal investment, because on one hand, recipient governments were seeking to decarbonize. So it was a recipient governments pushing for less coal in their energy mix. But there are also international pressures from both kind of NGO movements linking up with Chinese NGOs, but also multilateral organizations and individual states like Korea, say, taking a lead on ending coal fire. And I really like they use process tracing really well to show this kind of longer durée that underpinned that decision in September by President Xi. And the conclusion really was that, and to quote, that de-investing in coal was an acceptable economic cost with high diplomatic gain. And I'll come back to those kind of costs and gains of all of this in a minute. I guess my question, something I've been thinking about in our own work in sort of Chinese investments in European infrastructure, in looking at kind of green investment. Is green lending and policy, do you think, more acceptable than other forms of lending? Because if we think about the context of the papers we've heard, a lot of it is about the competition between China and other financiers. But it seems here you had a kind of an alignment where China said, okay, we need to decarbonize. We're going to, and so in this sector, you seem to get more coordination, whereas when you see Dan's paper, you're talking about competition. So is there something about the nature of this sector and the lending in it that allows you to have more kind of consensus and coordination? Just too briefly, and I think I'm picking up some of the comments from the next session as well. What I liked about all the papers in a way, especially the third and fourth papers, but Nick's paper also touched on the idea of patchwork, was that you're looking at a range of actors working across different scales. And as I said, what's nice about a number of the papers is that kind of relational dimension of policy and practice, that there are these bargains of these processes going on across scales, whether they're within a country or between countries or between a country and a multilateral set of actors, which I think is really interesting. And also that kind of agency of those recipients is not hidden. You know, in Daniel's case, you know, there's bargaining between donors. In the case of the coal-fired power stations, it was Pakistan or whoever other countries pushing to decarbonize their energy mix, which led to some of that. So there's not a kind of unilateral decision by something called China to do all of this stuff. And the second point I think that comes through is a sort of a question, comment, not quite sure what, was that kind of balance between coordination and competition. I think the third paper was most explicit about the use of multilateral engagement to hedge against the problems of bilateralism. I guess the issue is how far moves like this reflect a deep strategy. So is there a strategic move for this? Are they tactical, kind of reflecting the realpolitik on the ground, that you've got to do things pragmatically to try and get things done? Or is it a much messier sort of experimental set of approaches? When you have a centralized system as China has, but also a level of devolution and fragmentation, then it becomes impossible, as others have argued, like Hamieri and Jones, to actually then coordinate all of this stuff. So by its very nature, you're going to get kind of patchworks and messiness on the ground. But I guess there was a question about how far this is, I guess, coordinated centrally, or whether it is a kind of much more experimental set of processes. But as I said, a fantastic set of papers. Excited to hear the discussion, and thanks, Indrajit. Are you coordinating questions, or shall I? Or
I'm happy to.
Yeah.
I'm happy
Okay.
to. Yeah. It's just that I was, wondering if there's a minute or two of silence so that everyone sort of thinks. And but I wonder if it might be an idea to invite the paper writers to maybe respond to, if they have any quick responses to your comments, Giles. I don't know if anybody wanted to come in. Dan, Nick.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to answer. Do you want to do it in the order, or?
I'm happy to keep it open-ended. So if you wanted to go first, go for it.
Okay, then thank you, Giles, for the excellent comments, and I would say they are very much spot on. Well, apart from I haven't really thinking much about the wording adopt. I just, you grab the word. It could be used, could be utilized, but you do make me think that the word adopt suggests a coordinated, carefully planned use of a certain strategy. And that's somehow related to your last point. To what extent are these different actors or approaches coordinated? I would say they do try to coordinate, but I don't think they manage to coordinate very well. So there is some sort of a debate in the field right now. Some scholars argue that China's engagement in overseas government finance are completely wild. This provincial government does one thing and the other provincial government does another. They are not coordinated and they are not able to coordinate. I don't agree with that, because I think, although I do highlight the different roles played by different domestic actors, but I still think that there is some sort of objectives behind the government's promotion of certain activities through funding. They tend to fund some kind of activities rather than others. And although the Belt and Road Initiative guidelines are not very focused, but they do provide some sort of guide, right? So I think there are some center objectives try to driving these actions, but they are not very coordinated. That's something not very well coordinated. That's something I point out in my paper due to all kinds of factors. Could be external, could be internally coordination problems, could it be the inherent weakness of some of these institutions, etc. I think they do have the will to coordinate, but they are not very well coordinated. So that's the short answer. So maybe going back to the first question, adopting is not the best word. And that does make me think maybe some other word I could probably use to replace it. Another excellent question is if the bilateral approach worked perfectly, would China still bother with bilateral? I think the short answer is yes. Well, I mean, it's a bit of a difficult assumption to make, because we know that in fact China is engaging in both ways simultaneously, right? You cannot just at this point assume one did not exist. But I guess the crucial part of this question is, what are China's main drives for engaging in multilateral engagement? It's not only to compensate what has not been achieved in the bilateral approach, but also China would like to increase its strategic influence in the field of international development assistance, which is difficult to achieve through China's deals with separate countries, right? No matter how successful, for example, China's collaboration with Pakistan is, or with Kazakhstan is, that does not effectively enable China to increase its strategic influence or governance power in the international institutions, which is a very important pillar of current Chinese government's foreign policy priorities. So that's my answers. I also have some questions for the other panelists, but I will wait that for the later round.
Yes, thank you so much. Would either of the other speakers like to come in and respond to Giles's opening remarks?
Could I?
Please.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Giles, for your really kind feedback. It was really generous, and it was really nice to hear what you had to say about the paper, so thank you. You mentioned with my paper, the causality is like a key issue when looking at the relationship between Western donors and how they react to Chinese donors. And your question was more about whether or not this relationship that I found represents more China being a unique disruptor, or it just exacerbating existing relationships. I think what we found, and I think is quite indicative of the former, is that a lot of the relationships we're looking at are unique to China. Perhaps this could be worthy of more expansion in our paper, because we don't talk about it in great detail, but a lot of the findings that we found were unique to China. That is to say that traditional donors do not necessarily respond in a competitive way to each other, nor to other donors that aren't China. So there seems to be this kind of like particular burden on China, which I think represents it as the sort of leading emerging donor and the most threatening to sort of Western hegemony in development aid. But I think a lot of these issues when it comes to causality can't really be answered in a quantitative way, just because of the nature of the model. We're looking at data which is like simultaneously determined, and there must be like a huge number of variables, both those that we've collected and those that we can't collect, that will represent this. So I think actually the answer to the causality might lie in more qualitative answers and doing a lot more micro level research. And actually, as part of my PhD going forward, I'm going to be doing field research, and I'm hoping that that will slightly unpack some of the sort of correlations or causations that we're aiming to talk about in our paper. And yeah, so that's kind of my answer to the question. But thank you very much for your feedback. It's really helpful, and I particularly look forward to reading the literature that you cited, yours included, to inform my research. So thank you.
Do get in touch if you want any more details.
Yeah, I will. Thank you very much. It's very kind of you.
Nick, did you want to respond to any of Giles's comments?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, to say thanks very much for that feedback. That's very useful. Sort of a first try out for some of these arguments, so it's great to get this reaction. In terms of the question you were asking about, sort of assertion of US power on more kind of narrow grounds, and the role of the Fed in particular, whether that sort of poses dangers. I think certainly the answer is yes. I mean, one of the first things to think about is where US politics is right now and where it might be in 2024, I guess, and then what that sort of portends. I think, however, there are some opportunities here. So, for example, there's a bill in the New York State Senate at the moment about limiting the power of bondholders, which, if it goes through, that would be great. And that's sort of one of the kind of pressure points in the system, along with English jurisdiction as well. It's also the case that, I said that the Fed's interest depends upon the kind of the system, and then it will also, so if you're financially in a systemic way significant state, then you're important and worthy of consideration, if you like. Of course, I'm simplifying here. And the other thing is, if you are geopolitically important, then there are then political reasons to get involved in these sorts of things, as we see, for example, in Sri Lanka at the moment. But I guess you mentioned Seth's stuff and the kind of second Cold War stuff. I mean, I guess you can ask that question about the original Cold War, right? About is it better to be a strategically important state in the global south, in the periphery, or not? I guess if you ask the South Koreans, they'd say yes. If you ask the Vietnamese, they'd probably say no, right? So I think there's a range of possible different outcomes there. I guess one of the things is sort of who the creditors are. So U.S. interest, the Fed and the Treasury's interest in part is about systemic issues. It's also about U.S. capital itself. So is it BlackRock and Vanguard who are the bondholders, or have they been sold off to domestic bondholders in the country concerned? Or you look back to the example in the early 2000s of Argentina, the Bush administration didn't really care that much about Argentina defaulting on its debt, because at that point the bondholders were mostly sort of Southern European pensioners, which the Fed doesn't really care about. And in fact, for Argentina at the time, that ended up being a very good deal. I mean, very particular circumstances about where Argentina was economically then, but it does perhaps open up the possibility that some states will have more kind of freedom to default, sort of building on Jerome Roos's work about why that doesn't happen, and maybe we move into a kind of quote-unquote regime where there is more flexibility there, which have many pitfalls and lots of dangers as well. And I guess, we were asked to come up with a question about this, and I didn't end up saying that. So this is partly responsible also for others as well. Is exactly what you're talking about, Charles, is that what it made me think about is sort of, you may or may not agree with me about how I've seen these things panning out, but I think most people would agree that the sort of regime to deal with sovereign debt governance is in flux. And so in terms of what's sort of on the horizon, what's emerging, sort of where does the power lie in these configurations? And you can think about that at the global level, you can think about that at the regional level, and that's going to be important as well. And then also at the national and subnational level as well. And I think a lot of the other papers on the panel look particularly at that last one, which I think is particularly interesting.
Thanks, Nick. Giles, sorry, did I interrupt you? Did you want to?
No, I just said thank you.
All right. I see a hand up, and I guess we could take a couple of questions perhaps and go around the room. So did you want to go in?
Sorry, we are the authors of the last paper, so we want to kind of respond. So that's why I raised my hand.
Yes, of course.
Thanks, Giles, for your thought-provoking comments. I think, we are really happy that you made such nice comments and also interesting questions. So one thing I think we want to clarify here, I think this paper is really to use the case of this announcement of stopping co-finance as a case to test how different mechanisms of influence shape the very high level commitment in China. And I think also it's quite unusual for the Chinese top leaders to make such a commitment in international forum. That's why we think it's important to study this case. And as you mentioned, we draw on the game theory, try to identify two bargaining processes, so interstate and intrastate. And here, I think one thing to clarify is that when we talk about this recipient government or changing environment or in these southern markets, it's important to recognize it's not only about their willingness to decarbonize, but it's also about the changing market environment there in the energy and electricity market. So for the Chinese financiers or investors, it's no longer cost beneficial because of the change of the cost in coal-fired plants, but also the decreasing cost in renewables. So I think to that extent, in that respect, we kind of respond to your question about the nature of the sector of the market. So I think we need to probably be a bit specific or explicit in the paper. But I think what we try to argue is really like taking a kind of a longer term perspective to see what shaped this decision. So the fundamental driver is this changing global market environment in the energy sector, and then also to see how this interacts with intergovernmental bargaining. So for China, what we argue is also it's this kind of not really concession, but also like the policy shift. It's more acceptable in the global climate governance. It's kind of like do a favor when Western countries ask China to make some commitment on climate action. So in comparison to, for example, some commitment on phase out coal domestically, which is a very high risk and high cost for China. So in that sense, I think it's more acceptable. So I hope that answers your questions about whether it's a more acceptable policy choice. I don't know if I really, I understand the question correctly, but correct me if I'm wrong.
That was really useful. I think, I guess that last point about energy markets in those countries could have been made a bit more strongly then, I guess, in the next version of the paper.
Yeah.
But no, I generally thought it was very good. Yeah. I think there's still too much grey boxing of policy processes around a lot of this stuff. And so anything, and yours and the previous paper, I think were really good, really trying to unpack that level of decision making in China and how it gets shaped, which I think is vital as in this kind of next phase of research we need to focus on.
Thanks. And I don't know if my co-author Ying, she's also here, if she wants to add something.
I think for now it's fine. So I'm waiting for other questions. If any other have more questions, I'm willing to respond. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. There was a question in the chat box for Ju, which has been answered. So I think that's okay. Are there any other questions or thoughts or responses to our panelists? And of course, it's possible for panelists themselves to pose questions to each other. Yes, Ju, go for it.
So I have two questions for the paper of Sun Yixian, Wang Ying, and another co-author. Sorry, I didn't catch.
Chu Yu.
Chu Yu, okay. So the co-authored paper, I have two questions for that and one quick question for next paper. So I'll start with the co-authored paper. So can you elaborate a little bit on your theoretical framework? I'm quite interested in that. For example, the reason I have further concerns about questions about the framework is I really like the two elements you highlight, which is the domestic and the international constraints, right? So I think it's very nice the paper considers both the domestic and international dynamics. But my question is, what happens if the two elements drives the decision making to different directions? Then what happens? So can you tell us more about about this framework? Another question is, I'm curious, especially I know that Wang Ying does a lot of nice interviews with the NGOs and the practitioners. So while you're doing interviews, have you gathered the feeling that there is spontaneous or positive driving force behind adoption of a more clean energy using or less coal projects? Because the paper somehow describes the choice of investing in coal projects is because of the cost. right? It's like there's no better way to do it. The cost is too high, so let's just drop it. But are there any like more positive driving force behind it? Like they spontaneously engage in more energy-friendly business activities, or even further, do you see any ideational or ideological changes or discursive changes behind these NGO or practitioners to show that they are more willing to engage in clean energy projects? Thank you. And then a very quick question for Nick, that is, I see that the future looks a bit gray from what from your analysis, because of the coordination problems, because of the inherent problems in each of these institutions. So the question is quick: can this be fixed?
Thanks. Did the paper authors want to respond?
Sure, we can. So Ying, you can go first, and we start from the second question, and I'll add later.
Do bear in mind that we have a total of 4 minutes now, so yeah.
Sure.
Yes.
So thank you, Jeff, very much for the question. And in my experience of all the interviews for NGO sides, they are all very positive, because they're NGOs. Their role is to promote more environment-friendly society. But at the same time, because I have interviewed several state-owned companies, I think the so-called positive view of environment is kind of mixed. The perspectives they give is prioritized on the economics, but it does have some interviewees there, the investment manager, that they do care about environment, especially those who have worked very long time overseas. I think they do have a much more open-minded towards environment, instead of only say because it's economic cost that the companies have, so we want to shift to more like renewable energies. So that's the short answer that I can give. Yeah, thank you. So
Okay. Yeah, just very quickly. So just in the two-level game Putnam theories, we look at the winning set. So whether like domestic constituencies, where what are their preferences, of course, and then international pressure, and then to see if there is any convergence or divergence. It could be the case of divergence, but then it depends on top leaders' calculation on what they want to prefer, what's their what matters most. I think we don't have time to elaborate, but happy to discuss more. And just I have questions on Jeff's paper. I think I think it's interesting to think about bilateral and multilateral, but maybe something we might want to also add here is also about this kind of engagement with or initiatives of new multilateral platform like AIIB. So why? So what are the differences between like, engaging with Western-led multilateral forum or mechanism than this new multilateral forum? So it's not just the dichotomy between multilateral and bilateral. And very quick questions to Dan. I think I was wondering if you look at the differences among the OECD countries, how they respond to the China's lending or China's overseas finance. Because I think the intuition is that some countries are more receptive or reactive to China's activities, like Japan, than other countries. I'll stop here. I think you can probably do some tests.
Thanks. There was a quick question for Nick. Did you want to? I think it's a very quick answer that you could give. So do you want to go for it, and then we can have others come in?
Sure. So very quickly, can it be fixed? Yes, but I think it's quite unlikely. It depends a lot on US politics. But I think it isn't necessarily a negative if it isn't fixed. It's the future is very uncertain. Very vague answer.
Thanks, but yes, the best you can do in the time you have. Yes. Any other responses? There were questions that were asked at the very end. Anybody wants to come in?
If I can respond super quickly to Ishan, I just wanted to say thank you for your comment. I think it's very apt. It's actually the next paper we're going to be writing, thinking about the heterogeneity between donors. So see you next year at the conference and I can report back. But what I would say is that it's really interesting to think more about the differences between different donors. They're obviously not one. And there's a lot of really fascinating research coming out from Simone Dietrich. And I was going to suggest to Joy as well that maybe you could look into this if you haven't already, that thinking about like how donors are categorized and how they behave, and whether China fits kind of this neoliberal conception of aid, or this more like traditional public sector financing. And I think that's going to be quite informative to my research going forward, thinking about whether like Chinese aid is more competitive with these more traditional donors or the neoliberal donors, of which Japan, as you mentioned, is one. So I look forward to exploring further. So thank you for your comment.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Nick. Any other sort of quick responses, thoughts? We have to leave this room pretty quickly and enter the next one in 10 minutes. So
Sam's posed a question, but I think he's, as he says, well, he may want an answer now because he's not going to come to the next session, but Nick's responded, but it's also a question I think it'd be useful to pose also in the next session.
Absolutely, yes. I think I see Nick and Dan have both responded to that question, and it is something to ponder about, I think, going forward. For us as well, in terms of the broader research that we do and the seminar series that we're running, Giles. So any other thoughts or final comments insofar as you can have any final comments on something like this? Great. I mean, of course, we will continue the conversation in the next session, which starts in about 10 minutes, and which will continue some of the some of the questions that have been posed here, and maybe come up with empirical responses that are slightly different. So, can I thank everyone who's come to this session? Thanks, Giles, for your reading of the papers. Thanks, of course, to everyone who wrote the papers in the first place, recorded them, uploaded them a full 3 weeks in advance. We are very, very grateful. I think, the DSA particularly may not have expected how spectacularly successful it has been in getting people to record their work. So fantastic stuff. And Sam congratulates everyone. That's a big win. The president himself is here. But okay, I'll let everyone get along for a quick break, and we'll see you in about 8 minutes. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.